Have any friends that would like to come join me today, maybe? Yeah? Harrison? Oliver? Cool. I don't know if we have anybody today to take you upstairs, but at least we can have a chat. Harrison, I guess, one. How about you sit on the side, you sit on this side. Okay. You know what season we're in right now? Fall. Kind of feels like that. But I think maybe winter, maybe? No snow, but still kind of cold. Getting ready to move into spring, maybe? The hedgehog did see his shadow. And so that means we're going to probably have an early spring, right? Is that the way it goes? Yeah. But do you know what season we're in church? What's that?
I was right.
You are right, yes. Do you know what season we're in church? Maybe? Why we wear purple instead of green? Lent? Have you ever heard that word? Lent? This is a season where we get ready for Easter. Just like I wear this color in Advent too, and that's the season where we get ready for Christmas. But purple is the season of, signifies a season of getting ready for Jesus' resurrection. And so have you ever had to give up anything for Lent? Not really? Okay, I appreciate that. Have you ever done anything new for Lent? Not really. I got you. Have you? No? Well, sometimes, as a way of devoting themselves to the season, people either give up something or they take on something. And do you know what my family did one year? What we gave up? We gave up TV. I know, right? I know. I hated it.
One time, my brother said that it smashed TV, and my mom said, and she said, what? And then I told my mom, we go to come out in the TV, and then we had to go and get another TV.
Yeah, but you had to give up TV for that time, right? So it's kind of Lent-ish. Kind of Lent-ish. So I wouldn't recommend giving up TV, but if that's your thing, that's what you can do. Some people give up chocolate and candy. Would you ever do that? No. Nah. What about you? Would you ever give up chocolate or candy? Sometimes? Okay. So yeah, maybe that's his thing, and that's okay. Whatever we choose to do, whether it's give up something or take on something, it's to be to draw us closer to God. And do you think we give it up forever? No? Yes? Why do you say yes? Because we give it up and you can't get it again? Okay. What do you think? You said no. You can just go get another TV, apparently. Yes. But I think in some ways, and I'm going to go on a limb here, Harrison, I think in some ways that when we do give up something, or we do take on something for Lent, that it might need to be for longer than just Lent. Because in some ways, we gave it up because it was drawing us away from God. Does that make sense? Maybe not always, but I think at least we're supposed to learn from it. So are you going to give up anything for Lent? No. Okay. You going to take on anything for Lent? No. What about you? No. Giving up or taking on? Taking on? What are you going to take on? Not throwing the remote in the TV? Yeah, okay. All right. Well, whatever it is, maybe that's something you can talk about with your parents. And maybe it's not just you who gives up or takes on, but it might be your family. And think about all the time that you spend doing that one thing as a family, and then you dedicate that time to God. You think that'd be a good idea? Okay. I think it's a good idea. Yeah, we're there. Well, off you go. I think if there's anything that we could expect this morning by way of our readings, is that we hear this morning the story of Christ's temptation. Not having this story on the first Sunday of Lent would kind of be equal to not having the manger scene at Christmas. That's how intimately connected this story is with the first Sunday of Lent, and that's been throughout history. We always hear about Christ's temptation in the wilderness. But since, we find ourselves among liturgical traditions, guided by the lectionary, we find ourselves in the Mark year. And so we get something a little bit different today than we do in the other years. For instance, I wondered if you noticed that there is no mention in today's gospel of turning stones into bread. There's no mention of kingdoms given for the sake of homage, or even putting God himself to the test. There's just a single line this morning, and it reads thus: He was in the wilderness for 40 days and was tempted by Satan. That's it. Well, unless you count that part about, there was wild beasts and angels present. Don't forget that. That's very important, I think. To get the play-by-play between Jesus and Satan, we have to look elsewhere, namely in the gospel accounts of Matthew and Luke. But as I have wondered out loud before, think about this. Mark, the Gospel of Mark, was written, we think, sometime in the year 70. At least 10 years prior to Matthew's Gospel being written. And even earlier than Luke's Gospel. And so for at least a decade in the early church, there were believers of Christ who only knew sort of this one line. They only knew of this particular instance that Jesus was tempted by Satan in the wilderness. For a decade, at least a decade, there was no recorded dialogue, no soundbite, and certainly no transcript that allowed one to see what took place in the wilderness between Jesus and the tempter. And despite that conversation's absence in the gospel that we hear this morning, I would suggest that Mark's account of what happened in the wilderness is full of meaning, maybe in a way that we have never thought before. So let's take, for instance, the wilderness. I don't know about you, but when I think about the wilderness, I think of dry and parched places. I think of saguaro cactuses, even though they're not in the Middle East. They're in the Middle East. I see sagebrush more. I think maybe it's because I'm making this transition into being a true Oklahoman, if that's a word. I see dry and dark places. You know what I really see? I see Charlton Heston in his little pith helmet and his khakis in that little docuseries he did in 1992, like Charlton Heston Presents the Bible, right? And I see him like kicking rocks up the Galilean hillside, right? In this dry desert land, a sparse land. And I don't think that any one of us could miss the fact that there has to be some sort of connection between the numbers 40 that we get today, in the sense that Jesus in the desert for 40 days mirrored, albeit in miniature and perhaps for the manuscript, Israel's 40 years in the desert too. But something tells me that we move a little quickly if all we do is we overlay that understanding of 40 years in the wilderness completely with Jesus' trek of, say, 40 days or so. And I'm not just talking about the numbers, because that's key. 40 in the Bible is a pretty big number. I'm not just talking about the missing dialogue between Jesus and the tempter. I think what I'm referring to is the fact that there are some things in Scripture, some things in Scripture that really matter, and what the text doesn't say versus what it does. And so while I don't think that Christ's journey into the wilderness was a walk in the park, neither do I think it was something akin to like Bear Grylls survival school. I'm not trying to say that it wasn't easy. I'm not trying to say that it wasn't hard. What I'm trying to say is this, that when we encounter the wilderness in Mark, I think we are to remember that yes, it was devoid of, for lack of better terms, it was devoid of like humans in the sense. Like Jesus didn't run into a pal out there, like, hey, what's up? So in a sense, it was devoid of that connection, but it was full. It was full of God. Yes, Satan was there and tempted Jesus, but on the flip side of that coin, Christ was with the wild beasts, and angels waited on him. And I think that's almost an Eden-esque memory. You think back to Adam in the Garden of Eden. What was one of the things that Adam did? He started naming all the animals, right? And there certainly was angels there. I think sometimes we forget that. Nowhere does it say in the text that those wild beasts were ravenous and evil and out to eat Jesus for a meal. Though I think we take it that way sometimes. I think we make that assumption, even though the good editors of the Bible put a semicolon right in between that statement, and a semicolon, as my wife constantly reminds me because I abuse it, is something that separates two clauses, indicating two main clauses, right, that are related to each other, but not necessarily the same thing. And what is more, the Spirit is present in all of that, just like the Spirit is present in our own lives. And the story tells us that the Spirit itself drove Jesus into the wilderness. And this was not a moment where Jesus was like, hey man, stop, I gotta go grab an extra change of socks. The Spirit drove him, like he came up out of the water and he was gone. Given Matthew and Luke's account, we know that much passed between Jesus' return and John's arrest. But if you were just hearing Mark's account for the first time, you'd be none the wiser. It's interesting to think about Scripture in that way. And it's interesting to think about the nature of temptation, not only in Jesus' life, but in our lives as well, and how we might think about it a little bit differently. The fact that Jesus himself, and this is pretty important, that when it came to temptation, that Jesus himself had no say in the matter. You realize that, right? Didn't have any say in the matter when the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. He surrendered himself to the Spirit. And if you think about it, he had no say in the matter when he surrendered his will to the Father's in the garden. Lord, please, if it is your will, take this cup from me. In between those moments, I think we can all agree is the greatest story ever told, and perhaps the most hallowed prayer that we know as Christians, being the Lord's Prayer. And you'll recall that one of the petitions in that prayer, the one just before the end, or the one that we know before the doxology, goes like this: lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. I'm sorry to have to report this. I really am. But to follow God into the wilderness, to strive to live according to his teachings, and to avail ourselves to his grace is to be tested. And I don't know why this never sunk in before. But as I mentioned before, Jesus wasn't just tempted in the wilderness. He was tempted in the garden. And that temptation in the garden, the answer he received was no. Was no. But, this is important, but I think that's where the tempter met his match. I think the tempter met his match in the way that God, the way that Jesus yielded himself over to sacrifice. It took years, but we also know that the tempter was at the cross as well. Do you remember that section from Matthew? The one that goes, those who passed by derided him too, shaking their heads and saying, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, why don't you come down from the cross? If you can. He saved others, but he cannot save himself. But here's the thing. The tempter, as we understand him, the tempter was never human. The tempter was never human like Jesus. And so he couldn't know, the tempter couldn't know, that sacrifice is part of what it means to be truly human. Humans were made, as the letter of Hebrews says to us, to be under God and stewards of the world. And that the temptations we humans face, which Jesus faced in the wilderness, is to snatch at the world and use it for our own pleasure and glory. But the Jesus we know lived not for his own glory. He lived for the Father's glory. And he did that by totally offering himself to God. And we are bid to accept that invitation too. But as we know, that total offering isn't something we can do for ourselves. If we try to do that only by ourselves, we know that that's akin to pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and in some cases that doesn't work. And so that's why, if we look at the psalmists, if we hear the way the choir beautifully sung the psalm this morning, if we recognize within the prophets, they always point forward, teaching us that God himself will provide the sacrifice. God himself will provide the sacrifice that is necessary to cleanse the world, and in a way cleanse our own conscience through penitence and prayer. And here's the rub, kind of starting out Lent, I think. Though we may think we start out Lent perhaps at a disadvantage, right? In the sense that, Don't know how if we know how to process what happened on Ash Wednesday and the beginning of this season of penitence and prayer, and that in some ways we find ourselves thinking that following Jesus is hard because we feel like we start off with a deficit and wiping away our own sin. If we as the church recognize that we're past Easter at this point, right, in the grand scheme of things, that the Gospels not only summon us to follow Jesus, but later on in the epistles of Paul explains that moral deficit that is at the heart of sin, and that we, I think, feel subservient to, well, that's already been dealt with Jesus on the cross. And so if we can change our perspective and realize that we are free even now, even as we sort of fold back into being penitent, if we can realize that we are free to follow Jesus, we should be free to follow Jesus as the way that the writer of Hebrews describes as well. And that is to accept the invitation of Lent and to lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, so that we might run with perseverance the race. You know this one, yes? Sandy's like, I'm rapping with you, Nick. Yeah. That we might run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. And this is an interesting statement. This is a very interesting statement. Who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. This has happened. And so consider him who endured such hostility against himself from sinners, so that we might not grow weary or lose heart in the season that stretches before us. And I think that's because we have many, many miles before us before we reach Jerusalem.